Yes, in your book, Poetic Justice, you argue that reading literature can form a student's mind in an ethical way. But I wish for you to give us more examples regarding that. How can that help the kids make ethical choices?
Okay, sure. Now, in the book Poetic Justice, I had a slightly, it was related to what I say in Cultivating Humanity, but it was a slightly more specific question. It was about how certain works of literature, works that obviously have to be selected, not just any work of literature would do this, can help cultivate faculties of sympathy and understanding that make someone a better participant in a jury or that make them a better judge. So I was focusing on this legal context, but I think you could broaden it to citizenship more generally. And the idea is that when you're reading a work of literature, let's say it portrays the suffering of someone who's excluded. So let me take Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man as an example now. You're not just learning some facts about the history of African Americans, but you're actually participating. The literary work invites you to identify with the leading character, and then you take on some of the experiences, some of the emotions, and you have those experiences inside yourself, so to speak, and you have a rich emotional life as if you were that character. And that is actually much more, it affects you more deeply than just learning some facts. It could be done some other way. A class for younger school children might have the children put on a play about slavery, and they might learn that way. So I think there are many ways of using the arts to enrich the imagination, but certainly if you're dealing with older students, and you have large classes, having them read one of these great novels is a very powerful way of getting their imaginations into what it's actually like to be in the position of someone different from themselves. They could also learn this by interacting with students in the classroom who are different. And let's hope we will have pluralistic classrooms in the university. So at the same time as they're reading Ralph Ellison's novel, they'll ask the African American student in that class, well, how did you feel when you read that? And then they might find out something further about the emotions that someone has who comes from that history and how they're different from their own. But the first starting point of just having a richer emotional experience in connection with the perception of someone who's different from you is, I think, it's an invaluable starting point for cultivating a robust kind of understanding of a minority group that you're not a part of. And I should say, maybe I think about this partly because of my own history and how narrow it was. You know, I came from a very privileged family, and it was a family that was from the so-called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority in the United States. I mean, my name wasn't Nussbaum in those days. I converted to Judaism later, but my name was Craven before that. And, you know, I lived in this very rich part of Philadelphia. In school, I only saw people who were Protestants and white and rich. But how did I learn about the differences that my society contained? Well, all summer long, I simply lay on my living room couch reading Dickens, and I read every novel of Dickens. And I learned something from that, not just about the fact that the world contains people who are not Protestant and rich and so on, but I learned it through the emotions of little Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickleby or Smike, the disabled character in Nicholas Nickleby. And so, you know, these were my friends, and I had a wide range of emotions in respect to them. And I actually think this was one of the best parts of my education.
It's me again. It's just a question about class size. I wonder if this experience of being in touch with teaching emotions or making students aware of their emotions, can that work with large classes? Do you have any opinion about the importance of personalized education, or whether this sort of education also works in large classes?
Yeah, well, I used to always give my students an exam question that said, if Socrates or Aristotle or Epicurus, or I could name several, if they were here in the university, what kind of courses would they teach? And the students usually say, oh, well, he'd offer a lecture course on the examined life, or he'd do this or that. And they rarely got the point that actually all of them would have been quite horrified by the large class size that we have. They would have insisted on personalized instruction. Socrates never wrote anything because he was so skeptical of the idea that ideas thrown out to everyone alike could do anything at all. But of course, we live in a society where we can't have personalized instruction, so we have to think of ways of challenging people, making them come alive in this larger format. I think one way has got to be through writing assignments that challenge students to think on their own, and then the professor has to really write a lot of comments on those writing assignments. And so that requires a certain kind of support for teaching assistants, for grading, and so on. But if you're teaching critical thinking to 100 people, you better have a lot of writing, and you better have people who are prepared to grade that writing with lots of useful comments, or else they're not going to learn anything. With the emotion part, it's also very important, sure. I mean, I think it's a little bit easier to teach literature in a large class than it is to teach critical thinking, because, with the critical thinking at each step, whether the argument is valid or invalid, you got to ask them to be doing that all the time. And they have to do it themselves. With literature, there's a little more that can go on in the private space of the student without their having to produce anything yet. So I think a good course in literature will challenge students to cultivate that private space, will give examples of powerfully intuitive and insightful reading that then they are challenged to replicate. I mean, you know how it is in a good class. I mean, very often students will be asked then to write their own interpretation of some passage or of a poem, and then once again, if the class is large, there's still, they've got to write comments on the papers, because if they don't do that, then nothing has been learned at all. I mean, this is one reason I'm extremely skeptical of a lot of European higher education, because I think there's much too little feedback given to the student who's doing something from day to day. They have these cumulative exams at the end, and then they'll, often the exams themselves are quite routine. So, how are they going to learn anything? In Norway, in the University of Oslo, they have a class, they've introduced a required class on ethics, but it's a class with 500 people, and they take a multiple choice examination at the end. Well, they might as well just not have done it. So it's only if you're prepared to organize things in such a way that there are people grading the writing, and preferably you break the larger lecture course down into smaller sections for discussion too. So let's say I have a course of 200 people. I would also have sections that have 20 people each, and the people who would teach those sections would be graduate students in philosophy or literature or whatever, and they would be paid to do that, and that would be part of their graduate fellowship support. So I think that's the way that it's usually done here when it works well, but it's not ideal. It would be nice if the professors could have only 20 people. At the University of Chicago, we try to make classes as small as they can be, but that's not always possible. And I think I actually like lecturing to 300-400 people, because I find it's an exciting theatrical performance. I can really perform my emotions about the text, but then you got to have the smaller sections, and you've got to have people who are writing comments on the papers. So that's the only way I think that large course can really work.
Thank you. We have another question from the people that are watching us over the internet. Could analyzing science and technology development be a good point to foster a humanistic approach in an undergraduate curriculum?
Yes. Now, I think if you are in a science faculty and your students are primarily scientists, then raising ethical issues that connect to scientific and technological development is a very good way to get them thinking, in a course on critical thinking in particular. And there are. I mean, I've seen a lot of very good courses of this kind. Science and Human Values is one course that Notre Dame University in Indiana has that's a really wonderful course. And it's so popular that, in fact, you can't even get into it, and students are lining up to get into it. So I think those kinds of courses are really great. Any kind of critical thinking course needs a subject matter. It can't just be, let's learn the rules of logic. So one natural subject matter will be political decision making or political choices. But if you're in science, yes, the intersection between science and human values is very important too. And I should add that I think everyone should learn to think about the ethical issues connected with economic development, with globalization, with the economic policies of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So no matter whether they're scientists or humanists, they should all have that part of science, which affects absolutely every person's life in this world, should be absolutely front and center in the courses that they're taking.
Thank you. Another question from Mexico City. Sometimes it is the religion itself that someone holds what constitutes the main barrier or obstacle for that person to approach the study of other religions. In a university, how can we deal with this issue?
Well, I think very often people are worried, especially parents are worried, that when their young people learn about other religions, that will weaken their attachment to their own. I don't actually think that's true. I think what usually happens is that people understand their own better by seeing it in contrast, and they understand it in a more reasoned, thoughtful way. But I think what you can say to such a parent is, first of all, we're just asking you to understand other religions. We're not asking you to endorse their thought, or we're not asking you at all to join that religion. But we're asking understanding because we think it's very important for citizenship in the modern world. Whatever your religion is and whatever it tells you about other religions, we all have to live together. And we all have to live together on terms of mutual respect and some attempt at understanding. It's very unlikely that that respect and that understanding will be achieved in a climate of absolute ignorance. I mean, let's take Islam. Most Americans in the U.S. think that they think Islam is somehow violent, that it's connected with terrorism, and that it's connected with the oppression of women. Well, all of this, of course, is just a bunch of ignorant cliches. And if a student doesn't have a course that really studies Islam and the differences of interpretation within the tradition, the different kinds of Islamic nations that have come into being in the modern period, well, then it's not like they'll know nothing, but they'll know the stupid cliches instead of nothing. And so the only alternative to stupid cliches is real learning and real understanding. So I think that's what you say to that parent. Now, in the U.S., there was one actually very interesting Supreme Court case where a Baptist mother from Tennessee said she didn't want her children learning about other religions and ways of life because she thought the truths contained in the Bible were all they needed to know for a good life. And, that's not unreasonable position given the religion that she held, which was an evangelical form of Christianity. But what the court said is, well, that's all very well, but we are a pluralistic society where we need to talk together, and it's reasonable for the schools to acquaint students with the things they need to know in order to be good citizens and to talk together. So I think that's what you need to say to such parents, that even if their children know their own religion and are secure in it, that's not the end of what their duty is as a citizen. Their duty is to try to talk well to other people. And especially in this today's world where there's so much misinformation about Islam particularly, but also about Hinduism, about Judaism, about all the religions are objects of misunderstanding, then I think we have very strong reasons to learn and try to think complexly and well about other religions.
Thank you. Another question. What does a person need to move from the emotional to the action level when confronted with human suffering? I mean, to feel responsible of taking action to change the unjust situation.
Well, there is some research about this, and a man named Daniel Batson in the University of Kansas has done some very interesting studies about the connection between the emotion of compassion and action that relieves the suffering. What he's found is that when there's something that it's very easy for the person to do and there's no impediment, then if you can get a person to feel sympathy by giving them a vivid story about somebody suffering, they actually will go out and do that. So, they'll tell a story about some poor student who's broken her leg and she can't get to class, and you have a car and it's very easy for you to drive the student to class. Usually they'll actually do that. So it looks like the problem is not so much with human beings and their compassion, which works quite well, but with the many things that step between the compassion and the action. I mean, for example, if the person's not a student at University of Kansas, but suppose the suffering person is way over there in India, well, then they have no idea what they can do in order to help. It all just seems too bewildering. There's so many people who are hungry, and I only have a little bit of money, so what am I supposed to do? And so I think for that reason, you also need good institutions, both at the national level and at the global level. If you think about a nation, if we were supposed to relieve poverty by voluntary compassion alone, that would be terrible. We know that from the Victorian era, when that's all we had. And then what happened is that people helped the people they liked. They didn't help the people they didn't like. They talked about the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And sometimes they were just so confused about who to give to that they didn't do anything at all. What helps is a good tax system that actually takes some of your money and distributes it fairly to everyone. And then you don't have to think, how shall I do it? So I think on the global level, we need good institutions that will do that. It's much harder to think what those institutions will look like than it is in the nation case, because I don't really think we want a world state, but we want actually nations to just resolve to give much more of their money in aid to poorer nations than they now do. So that's something I'm actually writing about now. But yeah, so I think human beings their compassion works pretty well in a narrow and familiar setting, and what makes trouble is when it starts getting distant and large numbers are involved, and then even worse, when it's somebody that's a stranger and is threatening or frightening to you. And then it's like an electrical impulse that short circuits the compassion, and suddenly you think, oh, well, I don't owe anything to that person because that person actually frightens me. So that's one more reason why we need good institutions that are going to make compassion do its work fairly.
Thank you. And do we have time for another question? Do you think universities have a responsibility to include the issue of animal rights and suffering, or is this something that should be left for those particular groups that are concerned with this? In other words, should animal rights be a universal concern?
Well, that's an issue that's actually very, very dear to my heart. And I've just co-edited with my partner, Cass Sunstein, a book on animal rights, which I hope some of you may take a look at, and I hope it will be translated into Spanish. But anyway, I think the answer to your question is definitely yes. Now, of course, some groups are more concerned with that than others, but any human being who, eats meat or wears leather or wears fur, you're involved in this culture in which animals are being tortured, and so you better learn to know about that. I think that we can at least promote responsible choice. And the fact is that when people really know how animals are treated in the factory farming food industry, when they know the conditions under which chickens and calves and pigs and so on are raised, then they're horrified and they want it to change. And right now in our law school, we're working out a consumer choice program where we're promoting a label that will tell consumers how the meat has actually been, how the animals that are being used for meat, how they've been treated during their lifetime. Then the consumer has a choice. They can pay more for the humane treatment or they pay less for the torture. Well, my bet is that when that information is out there and when you can't avoid knowing what you're eating, then people will make the ethical choice. At any rate, a lot more people will, and then it won't even be so costly to make it. And so gradually, more and more people will make the ethical choice as it becomes less costly. We have a supermarket chain here called Whole Foods, which does have ethical inspection, and they don't buy meat from any place that treats animals badly. Well, I mean, of course, you might think that all treatment of animals for food is bad, but in any case, they hold up very high standards of humane treatment. So if you go to Whole Foods, you pay more, but you're participating in a more ethical system. And the tremendous popularity of that food chain is, I think, the most heartening thing I've seen. It shows you that when people have the choice, they really have the choice, then they will pay more for something that attains a higher ethical standard. So I think these things should be part of an undergraduate curriculum, because on the whole, people don't know these facts, and when they do know them, then they actually do change.
Hi, I want to make a question for you. In the United States, you have a strong experience of strong institutions, but in Mexico we don't have it. How to deal with the challenge of make strong institutions in Mexico, for example, and to deal with this point of view of a new education that promotes liberty, human rights, the concept of citizenship. I don't see how to work that point of view here in Mexico. What do you think about that?
Well, I think this problem is familiar to me from the development work that I do in India. And in India, too, there's a sense that the institutional level is quite weak and a lot of it is corrupt. And so when women want change, they don't turn to the lawyers the way they might here. And, women in the United States have gotten most of the changes they've gotten through legal change in the rape law, change in all kinds of laws relating to women's equality. But in India, they say, oh, well, that doesn't mean anything, because they think even if the law changes, it wouldn't be enforced, or somebody would be corrupt and take the money and so on. So, in that circumstance, I think you do need to keep working for stronger institutions, but you also need to act through non-governmental organizations, through the civil society sector. And in India, certainly a lot of the progress that women have made, they've gotten through the NGO sector. There are just thousands of NGOs all over India that are doing education, microcredit, all the other things that need to be done. And so I think that's where you can certainly turn in that direction. But I think you're not even going to get there if you don't focus first on education, on making people aware of the issues that need to be changed, and cultivating the faculties of sympathy and also of anger protesting against injustice that are necessary to bring about good action in civil society, but also ultimately to bring about and sustain institutional change. And I would say, to give India as an example again, through this tireless working in NGOs on the question of education in rural areas,